The confirmation hearing of Kash Patel for the role of FBI director serves as a profound case study in the enduring tension between executive prerogative and the institutional independence of federal law enforcement. Senator Chris Coons led a rigorous inquiry that transcended mere partisan bickering, touching instead upon the fundamental architecture of the American Republic and the delicate separation of powers. This exchange did not merely seek to vet a candidate, but rather to define the very boundaries of the Justice Department's autonomy in an increasingly polarized political landscape. The atmosphere within the chamber reflected a historical crossroads where the tradition of a nonpartisan FBI stood in direct confrontation with a vision of radical structural transformation. Each question posed by the committee acted as a diagnostic tool, probing whether the nominee viewed the Bureau as a neutral arbiter of justice or as an instrument of executive intent. The discourse predominantly centered on the concept of constitutional fidelity versus personal or political loyalty to the presidency, a theme that has haunted American governance since its inception. Senator Coons pointedly addressed the specter of political weaponization, questioning whether the machinery of the FBI could be turned against domestic adversaries under a leadership that prioritizes political alignment. Patel responded with a calculated adherence to constitutional rhetoric, framing his potential tenure as a commitment to the rule of law while carefully navigating the nuances of executive authority. This verbal sparring highlighted a significant divergence in how different political factions perceive the role of the nation's premier law enforcement agency in modern times. The skepticism voiced by the committee was rooted in Patel's previous public assertions, which many observers interpreted as a direct challenge to the established norms of prosecutorial independence. The nominee's refusal to provide a definitive pledge regarding resignation in the face of unethical orders became a focal point of intense scrutiny and debate. While Patel maintained that his primary allegiance would always remain with the Constitution, the absence of a clear red line created a vacuum of certainty for those prioritizing institutional safeguards. This specific line of questioning aimed to determine if the candidate possessed the requisite moral autonomy to withstand the immense pressure of the Oval Office during periods of national crisis. Critics argue that without a firm commitment to step down when faced with unlawful directives, a director risks becoming a facilitator for constitutional overreach rather than a barrier against it. Conversely, supporters of the nominee suggest that such hypothetical scenarios are often used as political traps to undermine the executive's constitutional right to lead the bureaucracy effectively. Beyond the philosophical debates over loyalty, the hearing delved into Patel's controversial proposal to physically and organizationally decentralize the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The suggestion to move the FBI headquarters out of Washington, D.C., was presented by the nominee as a populist measure intended to bring the agency closer to the American people. This plan, however, is viewed by longtime intelligence professionals as a strategic attempt to dismantle the deep state by severing the agency from its centralized coordination nodes. The logistical implications of such a move are staggering, involving the relocation of thousands of personnel and the potential disruption of critical intelligence sharing networks that protect the homeland. Proponents of the move claim it would mitigate the insular culture of the capital, while detractors fear it would leave the Bureau fragmented and vulnerable to local political influences. The inquiry into Patel's past rhetoric concerning the prosecution of political figures and members of the media underscored the high stakes of this confirmation process. These past statements were juxtaposed against his composed and professional demeanor during the hearing, creating a complex portrait of a candidate whose true intentions remain a subject of national debate. The committee's task was to discern whether the nominee's prior calls for accountability were based on legitimate legal grievances or a desire for political retribution. This scrutiny is essential in ensuring that the power of the federal government is never used to silence dissent or punish those who hold dissenting views. As the hearing progressed, It became clear that the outcome would have far-reaching consequences for the future of the American justice system and the trust the public places in its institutions. The tension between the legislative branch's oversight responsibility and the executive branch's appointment power was palpable throughout every minute of the testimony provided. Senators sought to extract concrete assurances that the FBI would not be used as a tool for personal vendettas, regardless of who occupies the White House at any given time. Patel's strategic ambiguity on certain points served to heighten these concerns, leading to a deeper exploration of the legal mechanisms that govern the conduct of the FBI director. The debate over whether a leader should be a reformer or a guardian of the status quo is at the heart of this political drama. For some, Patel represents a necessary disruption to a stagnant bureaucracy. For others, he represents a threat to the very foundations of impartial law enforcement. The historical context of the FBI's independence from the Department of Justice was frequently invoked to provide a framework for the current controversy. Since the reforms following the Watergate era, the American public has come to expect a certain level of distance between the president and the director of the FBI. Any deviation from this norm is seen as a regression toward a period where law enforcement was more easily manipulated for political gain. The hearing served as a public education on these norms, reminding the citizenry that the stability of the republic depends on the integrity of those who wield the power of the state. Patel's responses were carefully crafted to acknowledge these historical precedents, while still leaving room for the significant changes he intends to implement if confirmed. In analyzing the content of the video and the transcripts, one must recognize the sophisticated level of political theater involved in such high-stakes confirmation hearings. Every word spoken by the nominee and the senators is intended for multiple audiences, including the committee itself, the broader public, and the global diplomatic community. The discussion regarding the reorganization of the FBI is particularly relevant in an era where trust in federal institutions has reached historic lows in many parts of the country. By proposing to move the Bureau, Patel is tapping into a deep-seated suspicion of centralized power that resonates with a significant portion of the American electorate. This populist appeal, however, must be weighed against the practical requirements of national security and the need for a cohesive domestic intelligence strategy. The confirmation process ultimately acts as a stress test for the American system of checks and balances, proving that no individual is above the scrutiny of the law. Senator Coons' line of questioning demonstrated the importance of a vigilant legislature that is willing to challenge the executive branch on matters of constitutional principle. While the nominee sought to project an image of a disciplined professional ready to lead, the ghosts of his previous statements continued to haunt the proceedings. The fundamental question remained: can a political operative truly transform into a nonpartisan administrator of justice once they assume the mantle of leadership? The answer to this question will define the legacy of the FBI for the next decade and beyond, shaping the relationship between the government and the governed. As the first segment of this analysis concludes, it is evident that the Patel hearing was not just about one man, but about the future of the American legal identity. The intersection of politics, law, and institutional reform creates a volatile environment where the stakes could not be higher for the preservation of democratic norms. The dialogue between Coons and Patel serves as a microcosm of the larger struggle for the soul of the federal bureaucracy in the 21st century. This narrative will continue to unfold as we examine the specific legal precedents and the broader societal implications of this potential shift in law enforcement philosophy. The world watches closely as the United States navigates this internal challenge to its long-standing traditions of judicial and investigative independence. The intricate dance between executive authority and legislative oversight becomes even more pronounced when examining the specific legal mandates that govern the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Central to the debate is the concept of prosecutorial discretion, a powerful tool that, if misused, can shift the perception of justice from objective to opportunistic. During the hearing, the tension escalated as Senator Coons probed the boundaries of how a director might influence individual cases under direct pressure from the presidency. This line of inquiry is not merely academic. It strikes at the heart of the Due Process Clause and the guarantee of equal protection under the law. The nominee's reliance on the broad strokes of constitutional law often left the committee searching for more granular assurances regarding the protection of civil liberties for all citizens. Historically, the American legal system has relied on a series of unwritten norms and internal Department of Justice memos to maintain the integrity of its investigative arms. These documents, such as the long-standing policies regarding communication between the White House and the DOJ, act as the invisible scaffolding of the rule of law. Patel's candidacy raises fundamental questions about whether these norms are sufficient to withstand a leader who views the bureaucracy as an impediment to the will of the people. The discourse during the confirmation process suggests a growing appetite for codifying these norms into formal statutes to prevent any future erosion of institutional independence. This shift in thinking represents a significant evolution in American political philosophy, moving away from a reliance on the character of leaders toward a reliance on rigid legal structures. The discussion surrounding the reorganization of the FBI also brings to light the critical issue of resource allocation and national security readiness during times of transition. Moving a massive intelligence apparatus is not simply a matter of shifting desks. It involves the complex synchronization of classified databases and sensitive human intelligence networks. Critics of the relocation plan argue that such a drastic move would create a period of strategic vulnerability that adversaries of the United States could exploit. Within the halls of the Senate, the debate shifted toward the practicalities of maintaining a high level of counterterrorism and counterintelligence efficiency amidst structural chaos. Patel's defense of the move as a way to democratize the Bureau fails to address the granular technical challenges that such a massive logistical undertaking would inevitably encounter. Furthermore, the hearing touched upon the role of the FBI director as a symbol of national stability and a nonpartisan guardian of the truth. When a nominee has a history of sharp, partisan commentary, it creates a unique challenge for the agency's rank-and-file special agents who must operate without bias. The committee explored the potential for a chilling effect within the Bureau, where agents might fear pursuing investigations that run counter to the political interests of their leadership. This internal morale issue is often overlooked in broader political debates, but remains a vital component of a functioning and effective law enforcement body. Ensuring that the agency remains a meritocracy rather than a political spoil system is a recurring theme that resonates through every round of questioning. The legal precedents cited during the exchange between Coons and Patel highlight a deep-seated fear of returning to an era of imperial law enforcement. Reference was made to the dark chapters of the mid-20th century, when federal agencies were sometimes used to monitor and harass civil rights leaders and political dissidents. The safeguards put in place after those abuses are what many senators feel are now at risk of being dismantled under a more aggressive executive vision. Patel's responses, while technically grounded in his interpretation of Article 2 of the Constitution, often bypass the ethical obligations that traditionally accompany such vast investigative powers. This clash of interpretations reveals a fundamental disagreement over the very nature of executive power in a modern, complex democracy. As the inquiry delved deeper into the nominee's past work within the intelligence community, the focus shifted toward his understanding of classified information and whistleblower protections. The ability of an FBI director to protect those who report internal wrongdoing is essential for maintaining the agency's accountability to the public and to Congress. There are significant concerns that a leadership style characterized by intense loyalty tests could discourage whistleblowers from coming forward with evidence of misconduct. Senator Coons emphasized that the rule of law is only as strong as the mechanisms that allow for internal dissent and external oversight without the fear of retaliation. This aspect of the confirmation process serves as a reminder that the health of an institution is often measured by its transparency and its willingness to self-correct. The global implications of this confirmation cannot be understated, as international partners rely on the FBI's integrity for cross-border criminal investigations and counter-terrorism efforts. If the Bureau is perceived as a political tool rather than a professional law enforcement agency, it could jeopardize critical information sharing agreements with foreign intelligence services. The trust of the Five Eyes Alliance and other global security partners hinges on the belief that the American justice system remains insulated from the whims of any single political administration. Patel's vision for a reorganized and potentially more politically aligned FBI must be weighed against the potential loss of international credibility and cooperation. The hearing thus becomes a matter of national security that extends far beyond the borders of the United States. In analyzing the nominee's refusal to commit to a resignation under unethical pressure, one must consider the historical precedent of the Saturday Night Massacre during the Nixon era. That event solidified the idea that high-ranking officials have a moral and professional obligation to refuse orders that violate the integrity of the legal system. By avoiding a firm stance on this issue, Patel leaves open the question of how he would react if caught between the demands of the president and the requirements of the law. This ambiguity is precisely what fuels the skepticism of those who believe that the independence of the DOJ is currently under threat. The debate is a stark reminder that the strength of democratic institutions often depends on the individual courage of those who lead them. The rhetorical strategies employed by both the senators and the nominee during the hearing reflect the broader polarization of the American electorate. Each side uses the proceedings to signal to their respective bases their commitment to either law and order or draining the swamp of bureaucratic overreach. This performative aspect of the confirmation process, however, does not diminish the gravity of the legal and structural issues being discussed in the chamber. Beneath the political posturing lies a genuine struggle to define the future of federal law enforcement in a country that is increasingly divided over the meaning of justice. The outcome of this struggle will determine whether the FBI remains a pillar of stability or becomes a central battleground in the nation's ongoing political conflicts. As we move toward a deeper evaluation of the specific policy changes proposed by the nominee, it is clear that the status quo is being challenged as never before. The call for a radical restructuring of the FBI is a symptom of a larger dissatisfaction with the perceived elites in Washington who manage the nation's affairs. Patel's candidacy is a lightning rod for this frustration, promising a clean break from the past while raising alarms about the potential for future abuses. The following sections of this analysis will look closer at the legislative hurdles and the potential judicial reviews that would accompany such a transformation. The American public remains a captive audience to this unfolding drama, aware that the stakes involve nothing less than the impartial administration of justice. The debate over the future of the Federal Bureau of Investigation inevitably leads to a confrontation with the unitary executive theory, a legal doctrine that posits the president possesses total control over the executive branch. During the exchange between Coons and Patel, this theory served as the silent foundation for many of the nominee's assertions regarding his authority to reorganize the agency. Proponents of this view argue that since the director of the FBI serves at the pleasure of the president, the agency must be responsive to the administration's policy objectives. However, critics point out that law enforcement requires a unique degree of insulation to ensure that the power to arrest and prosecute is never used as a political cudgel. This philosophical divide represents one of the most significant challenges to the contemporary American legal framework, as it pits electoral mandates against institutional traditions. A central concern raised during the testimony involves the potential reclassification of career civil servants into political appointees, a move that could fundamentally alter the agency's internal culture. The FBI's strength has historically been its professional workforce, composed of individuals who serve across multiple administrations regardless of party affiliation. If the leadership were to implement a system where loyalty to the executive becomes a prerequisite for advancement, the meritocratic nature of the Bureau would be jeopardized. This shift could lead to a significant brain drain, as seasoned investigators and analysts might choose to leave the agency rather than compromise their professional neutrality. The hearing highlighted the delicate balance required to maintain a workforce that is both accountable to leadership and committed to objective truth. The logistical proposal to decentralize the FBI also invites a rigorous examination of the Administrative Procedure Act, which governs how federal agencies can implement major structural changes. Any attempt to move the headquarters out of the capital region would likely face a barrage of legal challenges from employees, local governments, and oversight committees. These legal hurdles ensure that radical changes to the government's infrastructure cannot be made on a whim or for purely political reasons. Patel's vision for a more distributed FBI must therefore be scrutinized not just for its political intent, but for its adherence to the statutory requirements of federal rulemaking. The complexity of these regulations acts as a stabilizer, preventing the rapid dismantling of institutions that have taken decades to build. Senator Coons' inquiry into the nominee's past statements about cleansing the agency of certain individuals suggests a deep-seated fear of a political purge within the Department of Justice. The protection of career employees from political retaliation is a cornerstone of the American civil service system, designed to prevent the spoils system of the 19th century. When a nominee speaks of radical reform, it often signals to the workforce that their job security may be tied to their ideological alignment. This creates a precarious environment where the fear of termination could influence the outcome of sensitive investigations involving high-ranking officials. The preservation of the Civil Service Reform Act principles remains a vital topic of discussion for those concerned with the long-term health of federal law enforcement. The role of the FBI in domestic counterintelligence is another area where the nominee's philosophy could have profound implications for civil liberties. The Bureau is tasked with identifying and neutralizing foreign threats within the United States, a mission that requires a high degree of public trust and legal precision. There are concerns that a more politically directed FBI might expand its definition of foreign influence to include domestic political movements that are critical of the administration. The oversight of these activities by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISC, provides some protection, but the director's influence over the agency's priorities is immense. Ensuring that intelligence tools are used only for national security and not for political monitoring is a recurring theme in the committee's rigorous vetting process. The intersection of media freedom and law enforcement was also brought to the forefront during the discussion of Patel's previous rhetoric regarding journalists. In a democracy, the relationship between the press and the government is naturally adversarial, yet there are strict legal guidelines preventing the use of investigative powers to intimidate reporters. The nominee's past suggestions that certain media members could be investigated for their reporting raised significant First Amendment concerns among civil libertarians. During the hearing, the focus was on whether Patel would adhere to the DOJ's established guidelines that limit the subpoenaing of journalists' records. This issue transcends partisan lines, as it involves the fundamental right of the public to be informed about the actions of their government. The concept of institutional memory is often cited by those who oppose the rapid decentralization and restructuring of the FBI. By moving the agency's core functions away from Washington, there is a risk of losing the collaborative relationships that have been built over decades between various federal agencies. The FBI does not operate in a vacuum. Its success depends on daily interactions with the DOJ, the CIA, and the Department of Homeland Security. Severing these physical and professional links could result in intelligence gaps that might not be realized until a crisis occurs. The committee pressed the nominee to explain how he would mitigate these risks while pursuing his goal of moving the Bureau closer to the heartland. As the hearing progressed, the focus shifted toward the nominee's ability to manage the FBI's massive budget and its various technological initiatives. The Bureau is currently undergoing a multi-year digital transformation to better combat cybercrime and sophisticated foreign hacking operations. Any significant organizational upheaval could distract from these mission-critical projects and leave the nation's infrastructure vulnerable to attack. The senators sought to determine if Patel possessed the administrative experience necessary to oversee such a complex and high-stakes operation. This practical side of leadership is often overshadowed by political controversies, yet it is essential for the day-to-day safety of the American people. The debate also touched on the perception of the FBI among minority communities and the agency's historical struggles with domestic surveillance. A director who is perceived as being hyper-partisan could further erode the fragile trust that has been built between federal law enforcement and marginalized groups. The legitimacy of the FBI depends on its ability to be seen as a fair and impartial protector of all citizens, regardless of their background or beliefs. Senator Coons and his colleagues emphasized that the leadership of the FBI must reflect the values of justice and equality that the agency is sworn to uphold. Patel's responses on this matter were carefully monitored for any signs of how he would approach the agency's Civil Rights Division. The third segment of this analysis reveals that the confirmation of an FBI director is a multidimensional process involving law, policy, and political philosophy. The clash between a reformist nominee and a traditionalist legislature highlights the ongoing debate over the proper role of the federal government in the lives of its citizens. As we look toward the final stages of this inquiry, the focus will remain on whether the nominee can convince the Senate that his vision is compatible with the survival of the Bureau's independence. The stakes remain high, as the decision will impact not only the FBI but the entire landscape of American justice for years to come. The tension between change and continuity continues to define this historic political moment. The fourth pillar of this political examination rests upon the congressional power of the purse and its role in restraining executive overreach. Even if a director intends to radically reorganize the FBI, they remain tethered to the budgetary appropriations controlled by the House and the Senate. Senator Coons and his colleagues implicitly reminded the nominee that any large-scale relocation of headquarters requires specific funding that must be justified through rigorous committee hearings. This financial leverage serves as a practical check on any unilateral actions that might bypass traditional legislative consultation or established administrative protocols. The tension observed in the chamber was therefore not just about ideology, but about the fundamental authority of Congress to oversee the execution of federal law. A significant portion of the discourse revolved around the Inspector General system, which serves as an internal watchdog for the Department of Justice. The independence of the Inspector General is vital for uncovering waste, fraud, and abuse within the ranks of federal law enforcement agencies. There are lingering questions about how a reform-minded director would interact with an oversight body that is designed to be critical of leadership. If the FBI leadership were to undermine the authority of the Inspector General, the internal transparency of the agency would be severely compromised. The hearing underscored that for any reform to be viewed as legitimate, it must be conducted in the light of day and subject to independent verification. The nominee's interpretation of the Hatch Act also came under scrutiny, as this law prohibits federal employees from engaging in certain partisan political activities. A director who is seen as a political surrogate for the president could inadvertently signal to the workforce that the Hatch Act's restrictions are no longer a priority. This would be a dangerous precedent, as the professional integrity of the FBI relies on its agents remaining visibly and functionally apolitical. The committee sought to clarify whether Patel's vision for the Bureau included a strict adherence to these anti-corruption and anti-partisan statutes. Protecting the neutral character of the federal workforce is essential to maintaining the public's confidence in the outcomes of criminal investigations. The debate further extended to the war on terror legal framework and how it might be adapted under new leadership philosophy. The FBI's role in gathering domestic intelligence is governed by sensitive guidelines that balance national security needs with the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Any shift toward a more aggressive or politically targeted use of these tools would likely trigger a constitutional crisis and extensive litigation. The senators pressed the nominee on his commitment to the Attorney General's guidelines, which provide the specific rules for conducting sensitive investigative operations. This technical discussion highlighted the thin line between effective law enforcement and the infringement of individual rights in a digital age. Another layer of complexity involves the relationship between the FBI and the various state and local law enforcement agencies across the country. The Bureau often serves as a central hub for sharing information on violent crime, human trafficking, and organized criminal syndicates. If the FBI's leadership is perceived as being driven by a narrow political agenda, it could alienate local partners who rely on the Bureau's objectivity. The effectiveness of the Joint Terrorism Task Forces depends on a high level of mutual trust that transcends local and federal political divisions. Ensuring that the FBI remains a reliable and nonpartisan partner for local police departments is a critical component of national public safety. The nomination also forces a conversation about the 10-year term for FBI directors, a post-Watergate reform intended to insulate the office from election cycles. This statutory term was designed specifically to prevent a president from firing a director for political reasons, though the legal reality remains more complex. The hearing touched upon whether the nominee would respect the spirit of this law even if his policy goals were to clash with future administrations. This long-term perspective is necessary to ensure that the FBI does not become a revolving door for political appointees every 4 to 8 years. The stability of the agency's leadership is directly linked to the stability of the nation's internal security apparatus. In discussing the proposed move of the FBI headquarters, the committee also raised concerns about the impact on the intelligence community at large. The FBI's national security branch works in tandem with the CIA and the NSA on a daily basis to identify and mitigate threats from foreign actors. A physical separation from the central intelligence hub in the capital could lead to siloing, where critical information is not shared effectively between agencies. This lack of coordination was a primary finding of the 9/11 Commission, and many experts fear that history could repeat itself if the system is disrupted. The nominee was tasked with explaining how he would ensure that the lessons of the past are not forgotten in the pursuit of administrative reform. The scrutiny of Patel's previous interactions with the House Intelligence Committee provided a window into his understanding of legislative-executive relations. During his time as a staffer, he was often at the center of controversies involving the disclosure of sensitive investigative materials to the public. Senators expressed concern that this background might lead to a director who prioritizes political messaging over the protection of classified sources and methods. The integrity of the FBI depends on its ability to keep its secrets while still remaining accountable to those who have a legal right to know. This balance is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the director's job, requiring a high degree of professional judgment and ethical clarity. As we analyze the nominee's performance, it becomes clear that the court of public opinion is just as important as the Senate chamber itself. Both the supporters and the detractors of the nominee are using the hearing to craft a narrative about the state of American justice. For some, the FBI is a broken institution in need of a bold outsider to fix its perceived biases and systemic failures. For others, It is a resilient institution that is being unfairly targeted by those who wish to avoid legal accountability for their actions. This fundamental disagreement over the reality of the situation makes the confirmation process one of the most polarizing events in recent memory. The final segments of this inquiry will likely focus on the broader societal impact of a shifting law enforcement paradigm and the potential for judicial intervention. The American legal system is designed to move slowly, providing multiple layers of review to prevent radical shifts in the application of the law. However, the energy behind the calls for reform suggests that the status quo may no longer be sustainable in the eyes of a significant portion of the population. The tension between the need for reform and the need for stability remains the defining characteristic of this historical moment. We await the conclusion of this process to see which vision for the future of the FBI will ultimately prevail. The concluding chapter of this confirmation odyssey centers on the most intangible yet vital asset of any law enforcement agency, the trust of the American people. Without the belief that the FBI acts as an impartial seeker of truth, the legal system loses its moral authority to enforce the law. Senator Coons' final line of questioning served as a poignant reminder that the director is not just a manager of agents but a custodian of a national ideal. This ideal suggests that justice should be blind to political affiliation and that the law should apply equally to the powerful and the powerless alike. Patel's responses throughout the session will be parsed for years to determine if they heralded a new era of transparency or a retreat into partisan opacity. The struggle for the soul of the Bureau is ultimately a struggle to define the character of the American government itself in an age of profound skepticism. The ethical considerations regarding the use of federal power to influence electoral outcomes remain a ghost in the room for both sides of the aisle. The Hatch Act and other internal DOJ regulations are designed to prevent the appearance of impropriety, but their effectiveness depends on the voluntary compliance of those at the top. If a director chooses to interpret these rules loosely, the entire machinery of the federal government could be perceived as a campaign tool for the incumbent administration. This fear of a politicized justice system is what drove the intense scrutiny of the nominee's past work and his vision for the future. As the hearing reached its climax, the focus shifted from what the nominee could do under the law to what he should do as a matter of ethical principle. The weight of this responsibility is immense, as any misstep could lead to a permanent fracture in the nation's social contract. The proposed decentralization of the FBI also raises interesting questions about the future of federalism and the role of the national government in local affairs. By moving the Bureau's brain trust away from the Beltway, the nominee argues that he is returning power to the people and the states. However, this populist rhetoric must be balanced against the constitutional necessity of a strong, unified federal response to interstate and international threats. The debate reflects a broader movement within American politics to dismantle centralized structures in favor of a more fragmented and localized approach to governance. Whether this leads to a more responsive government or a less effective one remains a subject of intense academic and political debate. The outcome of the Patel nomination will serve as a bellwether for how far this movement can go in reshaping the traditional pillars of the state. Judicial review will undoubtedly play a critical role in the years following any major reorganization of the nation's premier investigative body. Every policy change, from personnel reclassifications to the physical relocation of officers, will be subject to the scrutiny of federal courts. The American judiciary acts as the ultimate arbiter of whether the executive branch has exceeded its statutory authority or violated constitutional protections. This third branch of government provides a necessary safety valve, ensuring that even the most radical reforms remain within the bounds of the law. Patel's tenure, should he be confirmed, would likely be marked by constant litigation, forcing the courts to further define the limits of the president's power over the bureaucracy. This legal friction is a natural part of the American system, designed to prevent the rapid accumulation of unchecked power in any single office. The global perception of American stability is also at stake as the Senate moves toward a final vote on this controversial nomination. Allies and adversaries alike are watching to see if the United States can maintain the professional integrity of its institutions amidst domestic political turmoil. A perceived weakening of the FBI's independence could embolden foreign actors to increase their interference in American affairs, believing the system is too distracted by internal strife to respond. The continuity of the FBI's mission is therefore a matter of international importance, affecting everything from global financial security to the fight against transnational crime. The senators involved in the process are acutely aware that their decision carries weight far beyond the Potomac River. The preservation of the American brand of justice is a priority that transcends the immediate political goals of any single administration. As we look toward the future, the legacy of this hearing will likely be defined by how it influenced the next generation of law enforcement professionals. Young agents entering the academy today are watching these proceedings to understand what will be expected of them in a changing political landscape. If they see a system that rewards political loyalty over professional excellence, the very foundation of the Bureau's meritocracy will begin to crumble. Conversely, if the system proves it can vet a controversial nominee while upholding its core values, it may reinforce the resilience of American democracy. The dialogue between the legislative and executive branches, though often contentious, is the primary mechanism through which the country defines its path forward. It is a messy, public, and often painful process, but it is the hallmark of a transparent and accountable government. The transition of the FBI from a centralized, traditionalist organization to whatever it may become under new leadership is a transition fraught with risk and opportunity. The Patel proposal represents a fundamental challenge to the post-World War II consensus on how federal power should be organized and exercised. While the nominee promises a more efficient and accountable agency, the path to achieving that goal is lined with potential constitutional landmines. The role of Congress in the coming years will be to act as a vigilant gatekeeper, ensuring that any changes are made with the consent of the governed and the protection of the minority. This ongoing oversight is the only way to ensure that the reforms of today do not become the abusers of tomorrow. The American people, through their elected representatives, remain the ultimate authority in this enduring experiment in self-governance. In the final analysis, the confirmation of a director is not just about the person, but about the office and the expectations the public holds for it. The FBI belongs to the people, not to any one politician or party, and its mission is to protect the Constitution and the laws of the land. The intensity of the Coons-Patel exchange is a testament to the fact that both sides recognize the gravity of what is at stake for the future of the Republic. Whether the FBI emerges from this period stronger and more transparent or more divided and diminished is a question that only time will answer. What is certain is that the principles of independence, integrity, and the rule of law will remain the benchmarks by which all future leaders are judged. The conversation does not end with the final gavel of the hearing. It only enters a new and more critical phase of implementation and oversight. The story of the American justice system is one of constant evolution, marked by periods of great stability and periods of radical change. We are currently living through one of the latter, where the very definitions of justice and independence are being contested in the public square. This period of friction, while uncomfortable, is necessary for the renewal of a democracy that must constantly adapt to new challenges and new perspectives. The Patel hearing is a milestone in this journey, a moment where the nation pauses to reflect on what it values most in its law enforcement institutions. As the process moves toward its conclusion, we are reminded that the strength of the United States lies not in its individual leaders, but in its commitment to a system that is greater than any one person. The search for a balanced and impartial path forward continues, guided by the enduring light of the Constitution. Finally, the outcome of this political drama will serve as a template for future administrations, regardless of their ideological leanings. The precedents set during this confirmation process, whether they involve the limits of executive power or the scope of legislative oversight, will echo through the halls of government for decades. The American public must remain engaged and informed, as their voice is the final check on the actions of those who hold power in their name. The commitment to a nonpartisan, effective, and fair FBI is a goal that all citizens should share, for the protection of liberty depends on the integrity of the law. As the sun sets on this particular chapter of the nation's history, the work of building a more perfect union continues with renewed focus and intensity. The resilience of the American Republic is once again being tested, and its ability to withstand this test will be the true measure of its greatness.